Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now.
Cloud, you can begin whenever you want, Bonnitta.
Yeah, don't you want to say your thing?
I like it. I like hearing you say it, to be honest.
Okay. I always bastardize it. Okay, welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a place to cohere in dialogue, or decohere, as it turns out, in some favorable way, in dialogue about what matters most at this moment, this pinpoint of a moment, the spot, right here, right now. Okay, that's my version. Peter doesn't do it quite that way. Yeah, so welcome. Thanks for returning. Some of you keep coming. That's really nice. Some of you are new. So it's always a little bit of a design problem because in some sense we've built some coherence, some capacity about what we're doing. But we try to make every session stand on its own. But for those of you who are new, and please ask questions if you get lost in the weeds. There's a lot of weeds here. We plant weed seeds, they grow faster. They don't have to water them so much. It's not so much maintenance. So last week we worked with poems that act like koans. And I'm thinking we should do, we might do a little more of that today, but is there something that some idea or experience or some nagging irritation or some deep question or something that's arising in you that has a lot of energy? We could just start there. It's as good as starting anywhere. So does anybody have a comment? Yeah.
Actually, could I take you up on your offer from the beginning of last session about some sense making around a lot of stuff going on in America right now? I was just wondering what your take on like why suddenly there's this like attention and visibility on issues of racism and policing and like kind of stuff going on there. Like it's really, it's become very very visible to a lot of people. And there's a lot of talk around it. I'm just wondering what your take on that was.
Yeah, I do not really, I have some ideas. I can share them out after I say what I want to say. I don't really know why things come and go in the popular imagination. We went from COVID to George Floyd really quickly. Part of the reason obviously is because it's so horrific. The video is very simple, you know what I mean? It wasn't like nuanced, whether somebody was actually but there's also been, I remember one of the woman who was, the pregnant woman stunned in her car. There's been other videos that weren't simple either. I would suspect a lot of it has to do with the energy of being locked down. These energies don't go away, but if they leak out, they don't tend to kind of create a threshold event. My opinion about it is, I actually, now, this is nuanced. So I agree with a lot of the information ecology, but looking at it, I think there's a lot of positive aspects to it. I think the discourse, especially from some Black women that I've seen, is pretty sophisticated, and it's a kind of across a broad spectrum of interpretation. The number of people globally that have been inspired by this is truly inspirational. There's been a lot more like boots on the ground than looting, although the looting gets, can get a lot of reaction, and we also know that it's not always clear who starts the looting or how that's escalated. I think, what's very interesting is I see BLM as maturing somehow. Some of the conversations is much more mature than it was when it first started. So that's a good thing. And I think some people might experience that as being watered down. I don't know. You always have that aspect of it too. Do you know these guys, blogger heads? I'm not going to remember I'm not going to say the names right. They're two Black American intellectuals. One's an economist from Brown, the other's a linguist from Columbia, and they have been having a blog for a long time called Bloggerheads TV. They will seem very conservative to liberal leftists, but I think that if you want to get a sense of the kind of dialogue that interests me, you should listen to their last couple of podcasts. I feel uncomfortable expressing an opinion about this large of event of this large significance, because I always feel strange to try to speak for the Black experience or speak to the Black experience. Now, if you and I were hanging out, that's one thing. But if you're asking for me to be some kind of like public authority, I very much more would like you to listen to Black people who have had that experience, can contextualize it and not project over it. Now, I did have a conversation with future thinkers, which was a little transparent. That'll come out. And it was more like us just talking to each other and less like authority. So, yeah, if you can, I'll find that link before we leave today. And I'm not saying I agree with everything that they're saying. Sometimes Black intellectuals seem quite conservative to me, especially in terms of their economic ambitions. So it's not like I'm saying I agree with them, but it's closer to the kind of conversation that I think is important around the periphery of what's happening also in the mainstream. The mainstream event is the catalyst for these other conversations. But in many cases, the mainstream event does not have mature discourse, but that's happening elsewhere, okay? So, I don't know, did I answer your question without feeling like too much of a cop-out? And you could call me out if you want a specific opinion.
No, that's cool. That's the thing. I wasn't again asking for the big public, bigger kind of position on it. But just last week you kind of made that offer, and I was intrigued by what your thoughts were on that. So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I find myself being tugged sometimes. Like I have to check for confirmation bias. I sometimes so let me put it in a broader thing of how I surf the sense-making scene. Sometimes I have very strong opinions. You hear my strong opinions where I have them here. But when I'm just trying to figure out like what's the collective sense-making happening, one of the things that happens is and you should listen for this amongst the people we legitimize in these forums. Self-organized collective intelligence is not like collecting intelligence, sorting it through and figuring out what narrative works, right? Self-organized collective intelligence operates at the collective level like your brain operates. Like when you're trying to make a decision, you have a little bit of you wants to go visit your mom, and a little more wants to stay home, and a little, you have many different things operating at the same time. you have local wisdom, you have, you know, bigger ideas, and even the minority positions make a difference, right? So if you have a small reticence to act 100% in one direction, then the way you're going to language your opinion in that direction will be held back a little. It'll have a nuance. So when we're looking at the collective intelligence of the country, let's say, you want to allow in all the anecdotal information, all the real information, okay? Not the there's bots creating fake news and stuff. So that you will, and you'll get a sense that where we are at is 85% here, 5% there, 12% there, and that's who we are. Not just the 85% or not just the mainstream or the official conclusion. That's a reduction of the information ecology, right? So, so when people pay attention to, like, let's say, commentators that I don't agree with, but if there's a, they may say, oh, I don't agree with them, but they paid attention. So that shifts them slightly, and everybody's slightly being shifted, and you get the behaviors that represent the sum total of all that's in the information ecology at the same time. So you see this with how things start as conspiracy theories, and maybe they're not 100% right, but they start to shift what people investigate, and then they start to get more information, and then the story and the opinions mature over time. And a lot of this has to do not only with facts and the time that it takes to gather facts, but the energies and the spirit in which, in the context in which those facts or anecdotes can be said, right? So in a certain context, this is a principle from collective insight practice. In a certain context, if you think I'm being competitive with you, and then you call me out, you're saying, you just want to prove me wrong. There's a certain point at which I can't, doesn't matter what I say. If I say, no, that's not the case, you'll just think I'm passive aggressive. Like once you're kind of in this context or this structure, there are times when nothing you can say will actually forward your authentic meaning. Parents have this with children all the time, especially teenagers. You know, you can't just, like when your teenagers going through these stages where they just can't see you. It doesn't matter what you say. You know, you can even say, look, I know you're in pain. It doesn't matter what I say. And even that will get sucked into their interpretation, right? So in these cases, it's very important to understand the context in which what you say is held, and can you actually deliver your message? And if you can't, then this is a perfect time to practice stoicism, because what's important in the end is the behaviors you elicit, not whether you've convinced people you were right and you knew it before anyone else, right? We have this impulse to want to speak what we think is true as soon as we think it's true. So in case we were right before everybody else, you know. So it's always a matter of how are you inhabiting the space? How are you shifting the energy? What behaviors are going to be amplified when I've had my say, and what matters most to you? And that's a dialogue you have to have with yourself, you know. Years ago, I was in a house in Oakland, in Berkeley. Oh no, this was when I was in San Francisco. And we hosted the Zimbabwean Liberation Army, because they would have these meetings in the Communist Center in Oakland. You know, we had a house full of people running around with walkie-talkies and guns and a lot of activist / revolutionary energy. And I remember not being able to, like, really process that, you know? I remember when I look at the invitation now, it feels like there was me, I had these ideologies, and I was quite naive because when they came, I guess, I thought they'd be more like me. This is, when I was like 23, I thought they would be more like me, and they were, they were serious revolutionaries. They were really serious. I just tell the story because just one anecdotal evidence of like, pay attention to how you actually experience things. That's a truth that should live in the space too. Thank God no one, nothing happened. Nobody got hurt or shot or, I don't know. It was very overwhelming. It was very overwhelming to, on the one hand, have an ideology and then to feel that disconnect, experientially. That was not me. It was quite ideologically driven. I'm happy we did it. It was really a great learning experience. But yeah, so practicing the stoicism of really understanding the context. Are you in the context? Are you outside of the context? Really, not what you're supposed to be. Oh, you're supposed to be in this context. I can feel that and feel that I'm not in that context at the same time. In my courses, we move from what you should do to what you could do. Okay, yeah, I hear what I should do, but what can I do? What can I do? And I think I'm one of the first, a couple times back on this program, or whatever this thing is, this thing we're doing, I cautioned that some of these sense-making programs, a lot of them are white male of a certain demographic. And, the question is it theirs to do? Is the revolution or the emergent future, is it, I think I was talking about even Western culture, is it ours to do? Like we just go straight ahead, like, oh my God, I got you really serious because, this is ours to do. Well, it might not be ours to do. It might be, African, young teenage African women. We don't know, so just having to zoom out and being reflexive about your own motivations and intentions. Yeah, and I get like that. Someone called me out on Twitter the other day because I was excerpting something I was writing and I was going, we this and we that. And they said, who's the we? And I said, who's the we? And I said, of course, I'm speaking for all of humanity. I have an affliction to write like that, So that's kind of how public intellectuals write, but what's really interesting, and what I'm starting to work with a group of women who are thinking of coming out publicly, is how do we move from an information ecology that collates information. I mean, I think we need that, but like what happened to anecdotal and parochial knowledge, right? So we've been trained to put aside our anecdotal knowledge, put aside our parochial experience because it doesn't match the mainstream opinion, and we discount it, So and this came up because someone, because of COVID lockdown, moved from Brooklyn to a farm and started growing vegetables. And she said, like, she's noticing all these things. And she said, but I always read this and I always read that. And I'm like, yeah, because what you're reading is this collation of, who knows, narratives or something. And now you're starting to use perception and you see it's not the case. And good for her, because what happens is when we download official scripts, whether they're liberal, whether they're conservative, whether they're for social justice. But when we download official scripts, we can no longer actually see what is actually happening. We literally can't see it. When we take media for actual experience, we're making a mistake, right? So we have to relate to the media we consume as media, not as a window to our actual experience, right? So you need to go meta, always go meta on media in this information ecology, because it's not actual, it's an experience of consuming media. It's an experience with media. It is not a portal on the actual experience itself. And that's how we need to relate to it. And the question is, how can we use this technology so we're tapping into this other way that has been kind of discounted? And so, for example, the difference between, we hear a lot about memetics and alternative narratives, finding the narrative, what narrative is important. People talk a lot about, we need a new story, right? All of this, right? This is in this whole space. Maybe that's not the right approach. We don't need a new narrative. We don't need a new story. We don't need a new ideology. We need spaces where people can show up and tell their story, their anecdotal experience, and let it live for what it is. You don't have to attach it to an ideology or a movement or whatever. But this is just the kind of information these spaces lock out. Because the private experience will never match the public expression, because the public expression is a generalized illusion. So how do we, and this is why, I was talking to Peter a little bit about this. This is why the women in my group don't want to come out, because the actual events in their lives matter. And if they talk about experience they had with their child, there'll be 5 different narratives coming at them. You should have done this, you should have done this, you should, it's not possible for people in this ecosystem to be interested in their own anecdotal evidence. So when for example, I said I did an experiment on Facebook before I left it. I said, oh, my sister's hospital, there's nothing going on, they're laying everybody off. I can't tell you how much hatred there was on that thread because I said that. It was not allowed for that to live in the information ecology. Now, other people said, we can talk about this. There's a possibility, for example, if you look at cause and effect, it's very complex. I'm not saying COVID's not real, but do we have the appropriate response to these kinds of things? And the response was, for example, in New York, which we knew was going to, these urban centers get hit hard. The response was centralization. 1 or 2 hospitals received all the equipment and all the people and extra nurses. And so when you were out in the periphery, if you got COVID, you went to these hospitals, which caused overwhelm of the very hospitals. It fulfilled the prophecy. Our hospitals in the Northeast were in general, overall, if you take all, they were under exploited. But because we centralized the COVID emergencies to a few hospitals, we got the impression the media wanted to see. Our relationship to the nursing homes was literally horrendous, right? You have people stacked on top of each other, often in not nice conditions. The food, if you've been to the nursing homes, have really deteriorated. High risk population, and the staff just walked in and out. But that was a simple call. That was a simple call. You don't have to be Elon Musk to understand the complexity of that. And we didn't pay attention. We made this big brouhaha about, Cuomo and this and that. So the idea is try to think in practical terms, honor your local experience, honor your anecdotal experience and your parochial relationships, understanding that they're not general, you don't want to mistake them for the whole. Try to get more of that into your information ecology and relate to information. Your experience with information is experience with information, not a portal to the actual experience. That was kind of a long download, but I kind of working it out myself over the last few weeks. So thank you, because it was helpful for me to try to figure out what some of the principles I'm trying to develop are. And to be honest with you, that I have that sense of it's a cop out. I can feel that implicit in the situation right now is people want someone to take a stronger stance on one side or somewhere. And I'd be happy to do that in an actual conversation offline with people who have that actual experience. But all I can provide is my own experience. It's not a formula for the context of the whole.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah, and then I could ask you the same, which would be fantastic, right? Like, wow, oh my God, like I'm sure I'd be really, really surprised. I have no idea. I can feel myself projecting how cool it would be to hear from your perspective. And I think those kind of conversations are really exciting. And necessary, and people are having them offline and sometimes online, maybe. Maybe not, I don't know. Now what we've been trying to do here is more like develop skills, or yeah, it's a playground. There's like jungle gym, and then there's this merry-go-round thing, and then there's this and then that, and we just trying to do that. But yeah, I think it's something that people are trying to how do we expand the potential of this technology. I think there's been a first wave. There are people that I consider experts, like in economy. I like to listen to Mark Blythe, again from Brown. All these people are from Brown. Zach's from Brown, and these two other guys, Lowry. I can't remember. Love something. Anyways, yeah. So let's see what we have in the chat. Okay, yeah, let's see, we have some powerful voices. Yeah. Good question. Is there something else or some feedback on that? Did something sound?
Good question.
Yeah.
Bonnie, you mentioned a couple of phrases. You mentioned download the script, for instance. And I've been reflecting on this idea of cosmology as part of metaphysics, and I'm starting to see a lot of computer-based cosmological assumptions coming into the discourse. So I wanted to get a sense of how do you think about this cosmology of your personal experience? Do you just copy paste it from, say, Taoist or Buddhist or Stoic cosmology, or is it something else? And B, how does one reflect on this? Because that seems to be the main meta context based on which we keep interpreting the events and keep making sense of things and so on.
Yeah. So those are like your mental models. What's the script at the level of mental models? Is that what you mean? Like,
So for instance, like if I break down the metaphysics as ontology, epistemology, and cosmology, like within that, how do I not take a pre-formulated cosmology into the world, be that of modernist era, postmodern, or now meta-modern?
yeah.
How do I formulate an organic thing which is adapted to me? Sorry, this is completely off the tactical question.
No. Do we just follow the squirrel? You ever watch a way a squirrel runs, right? You just follow the squirrel, you'll get to the nuts. So first of all, I'm going to answer your question, but first of all, there's an insight I had. On the one hand, I do write about this and currently writing about it. I write as if what a person says is embedded in something like their cosmology, okay? Now, that's not actually true. People segment all kinds of beliefs. So it's not always true that these larger pictures or these mental models at that level, epistemology, cosmology, governs how they make sense of things. Does that make sense? You want me to unpack that, or does it make sense?
Just a little bit.
Like my mom was an emergency room nurse, a head charge nurse, but she believes in God, and if she goes into her cosmology, she doesn't believe in science or evolution. So they live in, and when you ask her, well, I used to torture her by like really pressing her. It's literally like she goes blank. Her mind can't make the connect. Like she can't see one from the other. They're like, they live separately, and literally people's minds go blank because she's trying really hard, but there's like a point at which like there's no more sugar left or something. So we don't want to make the mistake that for everyone, I think for people who are reflexive, we want the stack to be coherent, right? We're trying to say, well, I want this to be coherent, but this is not. It doesn't seem to be the case for most people. Even people who could, I use my mom as an example, but even people with more sophisticated cosmologies and stuff, these things seem to be able to live in different parts of our brain. But my cosmology, so I have different levels. Like when I teach, and I'll say this to my students, especially early on, if we're talking about evolutionary anthropology, we have one module on evolution. I have to say, well, we're just going to enter in this model. It's relatively mainstream. It's a starting place if we want to move off of it. But we're just going to use evolutionary anthropology. It's not really hard. Evolutionary biology, like Eric Weinstein and Sam Harris get in. It's not that close, but it's kind of we enter. So that's one level, and that's kind of mainstream. And but my cosmology ultimately is what we did on the first session. It's a modern minimalist approach. You just need three things. You need some kind of process or movement or something happening. It has to be self-differentiating. Or the only other way to say that, it has to have asymmetric attributes, which is self-differentiating. And the self-differentiating parts have to participate. If you press me, that's the only thing. Everything else is story added to it. So I pretty much, people sometimes come to me, they think I'm kind of religious or spiritual or mystical. I pretty much have that Taoist notion of so this morning I was going to write the non-duality of life and death. So if you think of that as a cosmology, that's pretty deep. I pretty much believe is a strong word. I work toward integrating that insight of the non-duality of life and death. I surround myself with it in my daily life. It's kind of like a penance I do here at the farm, raising animals. And like a bobcat got in and killed my duck. And then I have to, you know, it's like, and then I watch myself not being able to let that go. And then I'm reinforcing the duck stall. And last thing I need to do is being like cutting wood and making new, you know, but this seems to me to be a penance or a karmic practice that I've settled into on a daily basis. I saved a fawn from 2 dogs the other day. Yeah, so it's interesting, you know, I'm just kind of noticing that I wrote that this morning coming in. I don't know if that has something to do with your question.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I guess, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that your day-to-day experiences on the farm sort of act as your they basically embed your perception. And then when you're doing your insight practices, somehow you had these 3 particular elements that emerged: self-differentiation, process, and so on. And then you use that to formulate your cosmology. Because I'm trying to see how does one go about the process for themselves, because obviously there's no point in copy pasting someone else's cosmology. That's not the point. Because especially I feel like there's this embedded cosmology of our current society that we're living in, based on the job we do and the internet and all the inputs we consume. And I feel like that is becoming very constraining, and it's preventing me from discovering and creating, discover, like Rob says, my own formulation of it.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that that is a paradox. I think we have some impression that there's more discourse and more ways of looking at things, but I would say since the 50s, it's been really, the discourse is very reductive. There's not a lot of tolerance for ideas, you know, as Eric and Brett Weinstein talk about, they call it DISC or something, like the repression of independent science. Everything, pretty much most of this stuff is driven by, I think, the economy. I think it's the biggest driver of the kinds of games we play. Even if you don't want to play the game, it's not easy to play that game. So, and I think that has greatly, it's kind of like the economy, late stage capitalism, it's centralization and monopolization. And that's kind of what the information ecology is really also being centralized and monopolized. And the funny thing is, it no longer requires, it has a momentum of its own. So it's a lot of this discourse is socially sanctioned. It doesn't have to be sanctioned by effort from any kind of central authority. That's really kind of sad, really.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about cosmology?
Mm-hmm.
I have, well, let's see, what's the question? The question is that it seems like there are many different cosmologies that sort of pervade our, the ether. Somebody like, you know, Richard Tarnas could talk about the scientific cosmology and the way it's decentered us from our lived experience, and that's a very like heady way to think about it. But then I noticed that most of the time my cosmology revolves around like going to work and getting some food, and I wondered if you could talk about, like, when I didn't see his name, I'm sorry, but the man who was just talking about
Yep, Pradeep.
Freddie?
Pradeep or Pradeep?
Pretty, when he was just talking about the sort of default cosmologies, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what you perceive as the cosmology that is sort of the, if there is kind of a default worldview, or if there's maybe some different ones that depend on where you live, or you know, your kind of lifestyle, your rural or urban lifestyle or something like that. How do you think about, like, do we have shared cosmologies anymore?
Yeah, so I wrote, if you, I did like a 35-minute video on integral stage, the future faces of spirit or something like that. And in it, I talk about the spirituality we need. And I talk about spirituality as a set of commitments, metaphysical, cosmological, axiological ethics, and epistemological commitments. And I make the case for moving to process ontology. I think a process ontology, and then the metaphysics of experience. So to come from experience and perception to a cosmology, rather than have an conceptual cosmology that then formulates the container of your experience. So and so one of the things, so that's there if you want to look at it. I don't want to reproduce it. It's kind of boring and conceptual, as it turns out. Fight fire with fire, right? But one of the things for the psychotechnology playground that we can move your question to is something this very sophisticated insight practice. So bear with me here. When you have a cosmology, when you're thinking of your cosmology, when you're thinking of anything that requires systems thinking, like you're addressing something complex, if you are reflexive about that or metacognitive about that, you will see that you have to create a virtual frame of reference from which the question is coming. You know how I think on the first day someone said, when I said, how do you know you're talking to yourself? And you could see, you create a virtual representation of yourself talking to yourself, right? These are virtual selves we can create. So when you talk about Gaia, for example, right? We have this, let's say we have this system that we talk about Gaia. To talk about Gaia, the earth as a whole, what virtual perspective are you occupying? Not an experiential one. You're occupying the perspectives as if, for the perspective from space, looking at Gaia, right? Yeah, astronaut. So, so in these kinds of systems thinking, there's only a handful of perspectives, let's not call them perspectives, of these virtual arenas of thought that we can adopt, and we need to be aware of which one we're using in order to do some of these very sophisticated metacognitive thinking. So one is the perspective of the privileged observer who can see what they're studying, and what they're studying is they're insulated from its effect, right? So ecological systems management had this problem when I was in school. You know, we are going to steward the ecosystem. We're going to manage the ecosystem. And so there's this illusion that you're not embedded in the system that you're studying. So that creates one type of cosmology. And there's many cosmologies that would be in that. And this is true for cosmology. It's true for managers who, change agents think they can go into a company and change the company without it being kind of reciprocal kind of dynamics and stuff. Yeah, this is the problem Trump has. He thinks he can see the whole because he's the fucking president. He thinks the military is something he owns and not the expression of the safety of the 50 states. He can own, he's got this complex of, he always virtualizes his perspective like that. So that's one. And the second one is called dual causation. This is very popular in McLuhan. McLuhan will say we create our systems and then the systems create us. So in dual causation, we understand that we're creating the system, and then we understand that given that it's a shared context, then it creates constraints that create us. Now, in both these virtual vantage points, you'll notice that some part of the system is de-animated. In the first one, everything except the privileged observer is de-animated. So I can formally operate on it, it doesn't operate on me. In the second one, you have dual causation. So I say I'm both an agent in the system, so I can create it. So I'm operating on it and I de-animate the system. And then I flip and say I'm de-animated because the system is creating my behavior, right? So if you talk about systemic racism, a lot of people use dual causation. That's the virtual reality. Some people use systemic racism from the other thing. They really de-animate the agent inside the system. You can look at all these views from this formula. So the third one is very sophisticated. And it says, I'm embedded in the system and my actions in the system are a source of information about it. Okay, so this is a more modern. The other two have been around for a long time. This one's a little more modern. So I'm in the system and I'm an agent in the system. And you might say I need to adapt or survive. And my actions in the system is a source of information about it. So I'm not operating on the system's not operating on me. All agents in the system are operating and receiving information from the system so that's a different move. That's an interesting one. It'd be interesting to take these and say, well, what's racism from this one? What's maybe this is about anecdotal evidence. I don't know. I haven't actually used this formula to track something like this. Now, those are all, so the third one's pretty sophisticated. It's pretty new, but there's another one. So you can reread this if you look up my article on Medium, To Trim the System, Tame the Mind. It's written for organizational audience, but it has charts and stuff. The last one is so the last one I just described is called participatory inquiry. I'm participating and inquiring. But the new one that I actually kind of made up through my own kind of process that I'm exploring is called critical reflexivity. In this one, there is no inside and outside. So all the other three, they use the inside-outside mental model All those vantage points have an inside and an outside. And the third one, everyone's inside the system, right? But this critical reflexivity drops the inside outside. So there's no information to be gotten by the system, as if the system, inside the system, there's information. And it's a kind of ongoing vigilance of the quality of your participation and the lived experience of the dynamic participation with you, even of what we call so-called inanimate objects. This opens up tremendous amount of life in your world. And I think I've said this, for example, so nothing's deanimated. If I'm smelling the coffee, I'm thinking, wow, a billion people are moved by coffee every day. And tea, whole countries have gone to war by tea. You start to have this, it's kind of a neo-vitalism. There's no real information. It's just these incredibly dynamic experiences. You can start having that can be very psychoactive in your day. And then eventually you get to this question of the non-duality of life and death, because there's this you'll feel that you're thinking that life gets deanimated, like you have this kind of category change. So if you commit to, it's like easier for me anyways to think that dead things are animated than to release the notion that when a living thing is dead, it's not deanimated. So I don't know. That was a big question. That's about as all as I got.
Thank you.
Could I just reflect on something that came up for me in the kind of first half of what you were talking about? That I've been watching your videos on YouTube and really enjoying them, but something that's been coming strongly for me that resonated with what you were talking about was spending a lot of time and energy kind of absorbed in this sense-making task and complex thinking and coming to have some sense of relationship with reality and what's going on, but also that noticing that tendency towards feeling like I'm coming close to knowing what's going on, and then that developing an illusion of power and influence and then that tension between, oh, okay, yeah, I'm making sense of what's going on and I'm thinking more clearly about it, and then the sense of, oh, but what I think about it will have almost zero influence on how it plays out. And just that sense of what you said earlier of also holding that tension of maybe we're not the ones who are going to influence how it turns out. I don't know if that was clear enough, but it was just something that was coming up for me.
Yeah, no, it was very clear. This is what in my, what the spirituality we need, I suggest we need to, we need to make, whatever spirituality you have a commitment to certain metaphysics. And this is what I call turn toward a metaphysics of experience. If you think about the difference of trying to make sense of things, sense making, versus experience making. How can we enter into deeper experience with what's going on in our world? It's similar. So it's taking the sense, the word sense, and putting it in its original location, which is sensing through experiencing. You know, so like other people, sometimes I go on rants, and I usually go on rants by myself because they're horribly immature. But part of my rant in the sense-making space is what gives people the legitimacy to author the sensing that they're making. I think that's their experience. You know, there's a lot of people in the sense-making space, like consulting. There's a lot of consultants who never ran a business, right? Like it doesn't make any sense. Of course, it makes sense because business owners don't really pay attention to consultants. They serve a different function, but and there's a lot of economists that you know just have some kind of, they've read a lot about economists and they get a sense of what the academic discourse is on it, and then they start cleverly putting together ideas and blah blah blah. You know, Mark Blythe is a great economist. He's like, they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. You know, like they don't actually know real people that have to like pay bills and stuff, you know. So there's a lot of people in the sense-making space talking about community that have no friends. I'll tell you that right up front, right now. I'm not going to name names, but they have no friends. Maybe they have that legitimate authority then on building community and liberal politics and blah, 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 right? So you don't want to be one of those people.
Hi, Bonnitta. I wanted to add a kind of a question. Thanks a lot for all of the material you've put out. I've really enjoyed it in the last few weeks we have on Emerge and the presentations, and I'm working through it and enjoying it and appreciate you particularly. You mentioned before that you had a group of women that don't want to speak out. And it reminded me of a podcast you had with Jordan Hall and Daniel Thorson, where you guys were in a kind of creative, generative space of unknowing. And it seemed like there was a high possibility of learning and really discovering something new together, which was beautiful and inspiring. And then I kind of contrast that to what you were saying earlier about the women who were afraid to speak and maybe the generalized illusions coming back at them. And I'm thinking about that generally. How do we sort of preserve our parochial perspective or our sense of our experience? You know, and one model is like, you know, I'm just nervous talking right now because you're judging me, so I need to work on my psychology. And like another model is, you know, we need to create safe spaces so that my parochial perspectives and the creative generative spaces can grow. But we're sort of in a land project now, and we have multiple perspectives, you know, and we have some of them that we're even conscious of, these generalized solutions that are coming in, maybe normative, you know, like normal ideas about ownership and patriarchy and, you know, things, artifacts from capitalism we don't want to bring in. So we're kind of trying to create a discussion. We can't always get to the generative space. But I'm just, these are some of the things I'm wrestling with, and I thought you could help with that. And it's related to what you're saying before.
Yeah, so this has been going on for almost a year. It's a design problem. You know, I'm kind of like the person that can you you know, I'm like the person that like makes some of these appearances and tells people what the backstory is like. So it's not that people can't, like myself, women can't come up and do these things. It's for them, not so much for me. You know, I like this is a really nice space for me, but it's for them. It's that they feel like they would have to adopt a false role in order for it to be beneficial to the audience. I mean, like the conversations we have are way too nuanced. I don't think these people want safe places, and I don't think they're afraid to speak. They care more about, well, what's the value? What's the value of this in these spaces? And we have a sense that there is a lot of value, but we don't know how to produce that. Now, I have a crazy intuition. I think there's something about radio. Do you ever listen to radio? I know young people don't listen to radio, not podcasts, but radio. Yeah. That's very appealing to the design of the space, because women, you know, you put the radio on loud and you walk around and you do things, and you get in the car to run and you have the radio on, something like NPR, but of course NPR is not like edgy here. So we were talking about like the platform itself, and have this like fascination with radio, I even have the idea to call it high pitch, because I have a high pitched voice and I hate it. You know, like that's a female thing. Like I never listen to myself because what's that voice going? But also like when you give a pitch, it's, you know, like when you're pitching something or trying to convince someone. So we've been like playing around with it, but there's something that we can't see yet. You know, there's something about the design problem. Yeah. And then I, you know, we might like do a beta version here on the Stoa. It might be fun. Yeah. But it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. You know, years ago, they had Integral Chicks. Did you guys ever watch that? This is like old culture. And they did a really good job. You know, it was very much a woman's space without being about women's issues. You know, like there's a lot of women podcasts. All they do is talk about women's issues, right? So, but you know, it didn't last for, it didn't get a large audience. Something about the platform design. That's what we're trying to figure out. I think you have a better, you know, a lot of women voices are really good in produced video, like, you know, song dance videos. They're highly produced. There's a lot of creativity, but we're trying to figure out what does that look live in a live kind of community space. Good questions. We could go on forever, but I think we're wrapped up.
I just want to welcome that up, you know, that prototype that you just mentioned, Bonnitta, here at the Stoa.
Okay, time for one last question if it's got a lot of energy. All right, I'm going to indulge. I'm going to read one poem. And it has something to do with this non-duality of life and death that did come up, and then we'll just end with this. Cool sweetness arising like the perpetual cat at breakfast, sipping cool, sweet cream. Even angels need reminding why they are born. Once, twice, thrice, 1,000 times over, mommies and daddies, babies born alive and babies born dead. The tantric dirt rises up and swallows us all effortlessly. This too is living. This too is dead. Being here over there is Bardo. Crossing over, like the slip undressing the woman in your dreams, is love. Remember, though, not to make too much of it, not to give it too much life and too little death. Be instead in the grass, among the flowers, sipping nectar, stealing pollen out of gratitude for the sun, that great pavilion of iridescence up there where we look for God.